Thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation about the history and the diverse military and cultural aspects of the former Mare Island Naval Shipyard. First, let's get oriented by looking at this aerial photo of Mare Island taken back when the shipyard was still operational. You are looking north from San Pablo Bay up into the Napa Valley with the shipyard on your left and the city of Vallejo on your right. With that in mind, let's cover how and why Mare Island Naval Shipyard came to be and the critical role that it played in our Navy and our national story during its 142 years of operation. In those years, our country was torn apart by our bloodiest war as we fought, to paraphrase President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, to see if a republic conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal can long endure. Emerging from that conflict, our nation soon transitioned from its isolationistic roots to ascend to the world stage as a global superpower, and Mare Island transitioned from building and repairing steam-powered side-wheel gunboats to fielding nuclear-powered warships, brandishing weapons of unimaginable power. Here we see a hydrographic map of the San Francisco North Bay showing Mare Island in 1857. There's enough detail on the map that you can see early structures built on what was a vacant island only a few years before. So how and why did Mare Island become the first naval base on the Pacific coast? It began when the U.S. Congress declared war on Mexico following armed conflict over a border dispute along the Texas border. Upon hearing of the outbreak of war, Rear Admiral Sloat, whose fleet was anchored in Monterey, ordered his troops ashore to raise the American flag at the Monterey Customs House. The war raged for 2 years, and then, in 1848, James Marshall famously discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in the California foothills. Independent of that discovery, negotiators finalized the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the Mexican War, and under that treaty, much of the Pacific Southwest, including California, was sold to the United States. Then 2 years after that, California achieved statehood out on a completely undefended coastline. This map illustrates how California stood separated from the rest of the states by unsettled territories. This photograph shows San Francisco in 1851 and the many clipper ships in the harbor. Many of the ships were simply abandoned as crews slipped off to seek their fortunes prospecting for gold. There was no capability to dry dock any ship that did seek to operate on the California coast, so the only option for bottom repairs was to seek out a beach at high tide and careen the ship to conduct the repairs. Obviously, you only had a short window of time before the tide would return. Your other option was to sail around Cape Horn to return to the East Coast shipyards. Anyone traveling to California from the rest of the United States had 3 options: travel overland by wagon train, sail around Cape Horn, or sail to the Isthmus of Panama, travel by foot and boat across the isthmus, and then board another boat for transfer to California. To correct this problem, in 1852, the Secretary of the Navy ordered a naval commission to select a site for a naval yard on the Pacific coast. That commission was headed by Commodore Sloat, who had ordered the flag raised at Monterey 6 years before. The commission selected Mare Island, and in 1853, Mare Island was purchased and a sectional floating dry dock was built on the east coast and brought in pieces on clipper ships to be assembled on the island. This picture shows the warship St. Mary's being raised out of the water in the dry dock. And this photo shows the Hanscom House, which was one of the first structures built for Navy contractors operating the dry dock. Following the selection of Mare Island as the site of a new naval shipyard, William P. S. Sanger, the civil engineer of the Bureau of Navy Yards and Docks, developed the plan you see here for the new naval shipyard. Captain Farragut was also selected to be the Mare Island's first shipyard commander, and he was provided with a copy of the Sanger plan and headed for California by way of the Isthmus of Panama. Upon arrival in September of 1854, he immediately set to work constructing a shipyard on the barren island. For the next 4 years, he dealt with many challenges of obtaining skilled labor and materials necessary to construct the many buildings needed to make the Sanger plan a reality. This included the oldest building on the shipyard, the former smithery located as shown by the red circle. That building served as the Mare Island Museum for 16 years until it was shut down first by COVID and then by the city of Vallejo due to structural concerns. Then, in 1858, Farragut departed for Civil War fame, and as shown in this photograph, he had overseen considerable progress. In the photograph, you are looking to the west from Vallejo, with the shipyard in the background on the other side of the Mare Island Strait. Visible in the photograph are the sectional floating dry dock, the officers' housing, the former museum building, and a number of others, some of which remain to this day. Farragut and his flagship, the Hartford, went on to become prominent in our nation's naval history. Here you see Hartford in Mare Island's historic granite dry dock, where even though obsolete, its fame was such that the Mare Island workers completely rebuilt it 30 years after the end of the Civil War. The Union plan for defeating the Confederacy emphasized a Union blockade of southern ports and the capture of the Mississippi River to cut the South in two. In this picture, you can see Farragut aboard the Hartford. The key to controlling the Mississippi River was to capture New Orleans, and to do that, 2 Confederate forts stood in the way just below the city, blocking access to any Union attempt to come up the river. The first Union strategy was to capture the forts and then take New Orleans. But Farragut decided to just run his fleet past the forts, theorizing that once he captured New Orleans, he could cut off the lines of supply to the forts and force their surrender. Farragut was right, and to great acclaim, the Confederacy was cut in half. Farragut next turned his attention to Mobile Bay, Alabama, which was defended by several forts, the largest of which was Fort Morgan. A line of mines, known then as torpedoes, on one side of the bay's channel obliged any attacking ships to pass close to Fort Morgan on the other side of the channel, and the Confederate ironclad Tennessee was also stationed in the bay. As Farragut's fleet ran the gauntlet into the bay, his lead monitor was demolished by a mine. His whole line of ships drifted into confusion under the very guns of Fort Morgan. As disaster seemed imminent, Farragut shouted his famous words, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Then the Tennessee emerged from the shelter of the fort, and after a hard fight, during which it was repeatedly rammed, it surrendered. The forts were isolated and surrendered one by one, with Fort Morgan the last to do so. This was a bloody engagement, and the Hartford's decks ran red with blood, including Seaman Richard Dunphy, who lost both arms in the engagement. Farragut looked after his men, and in addition to recognizing Dunphy with the Medal of Honor, he also ensured Dunphy was provided employment at Mare Island as a yard courier. Years later, Dunphy would have walked by his old warship on his rounds as it was being rebuilt. Among the museum's artifacts are Dunphy's Medal of Honor, a fork that Dunphy modified so he could feed himself, this cannon in Alden Park that was fired in anger during the capture of New Orleans and the Battle of Mobile Bay, and this catheads plate from the Hartford. The first warship to ever be built on the West Coast was the gunboat USS Saginaw, as shown here in the only known photograph of her. Launched in 1859, she was a matter of tremendous pride for all Californians, as she was built with California materials and by California craftsmen. 2 years later, when the Confederate Navy fired on Fort Sumter, the USS Asiatic Squadron, including the Saginaw and Hartford, were far up the Yangtze River on a diplomatic mission to open China to U.S. trade. Recalled immediately, the Saginaw was put to work protecting gold shipments from Confederate raiders on the Pacific coast, and the Hartford was sent to the Gulf Coast as part of the Anaconda Plan to blockade the South. 1870 found the Saginaw on Midway Island, and following that assignment, her captain decided to sail by the Kure Atoll 60 miles away to check for shipwrecked sailors. Due to an error in navigation, the Saginaw wrecked on the coral of the atoll in calm seas and at night. The would-be rescuers were now shipwrecked themselves. The gig of the gunboat was salvaged and converted to a decked-over sailboat to be used to seek rescue for the rest of the crew. 5 volunteers then set out to sail and row 1,000 miles to the Hawaiian island of Kauai to seek rescue. Starved and weakened, 4 died in the surf attempting a landing in Kauai, but coxswain William Halford survived and succeeded in obtaining rescue for the rest of the crew. The gig survives to this day, is in a Navy warehouse in Maryland. William Halford lived until 1919, and he is buried in the Mare Island Cemetery. The sidewheel shaft from the Saginaw was recently discovered at Ocean Island by divers from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Former President Theodore Roosevelt liked to quote an old African proverb that goes, "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." Despite the wisdom of that proverb, one of the constants of U.S. military experience is that at the end of major armed conflict, our force structure is always followed by a period of decline. Such was the case following the Civil War, and while that decline had consequences, the U.S. Asiatic Squadron was still able to respond to the burning of an American merchant vessel and the murder of its crew by the 500-year-old Kingdom of Joseon in Korea. The initial goal of the U.S. fleet, led by Admiral John Rogers, was to negotiate for the access and safety of U.S. ships in Korea. But when Korean forts opened fire on his fleet, the mission soon changed to a punitive expedition. 600 Marines were sent ashore to take 3 forts in conjunction with bombardment by the fleet. While the assaults were successful and the forts captured, the Koreans would not negotiate. However, they didn't attack U.S. merchant ships again. These breech-loading pivot guns were captured by the Marines when taking the forts, and they are among the artifacts in our inventory. Despite that success, the U.S. was powerless to react to the actions of Spain much closer to home in the Caribbean 2 years later. Spain was a major naval power for which our Navy was no match in what became known as the Virginius Affair. Virginius was a fast American ship hired by Cuban insurrectionists to land men and munitions in Cuba to attack the Spanish regime. It was captured at sea by the Spanish Navy. They then tried the men as pirates and executed 53 of them, including Americans. While there was talk of the U.S. responding militarily, the U.S. did not have sufficient resources to counter the Spanish Navy, and the crisis was ultimately resolved diplomatically. While the post-Civil War Navy was extremely limited in size, Mare Island did manage to receive funding to construct a few ships, such as the USS Mohican shown here. However, as evidenced by the 13-year build period between when she was first laid down to when she was commissioned, funding was extremely restricted, and she was obsolete when she went into service. This monitor took even longer to build, taking 20 years from keel laying to commissioning, but her construction was complicated by the fact that she was originally laid down at a private shipyard in Vallejo before being towed to Mare Island to be completed. The Navy sent Monadnock to the Philippines 2 years after completion, where she saw action in the Spanish-American War. In 1898, the United States crossed a major threshold. 122 years earlier, the nation was characterized by isolationistic sentiments, as evidenced by the farewell address of our first president. He warned that the fledgling nation needed to avoid foreign entanglements. However, events in Spanish-controlled Cuba were about to put an end to isolationism as the United States pivoted to an age of empire. In this photo, you can see Mare Island as it existed around 1898. Visible in the photo are the sectional floating dry dock, that came around Cape Horn on clipper ships in 1854. The original smithery from 1855, the headquarters building from 1872, and in front of it, Alden Park, the officers' housing, and the original hospital. In this photo, you see the protected cruiser USS Olympia in the new granite dry dock as she completes outfitting and is commissioned. Then, in response to rising tensions associated with revolution in Cuba, the battleship USS Maine entered Havana Harbor. Just days later, the Maine exploded and sank with great loss of life. Suspicion of Spanish involvement in the sinking put the U.S. Navy on a war footing, and out at Mare Island, workers went on around-the-clock shift structure to prepare ships for war. On March 28th, President McKinley reported to Congress the results of the Navy's Sampson Board of Inquiry into the causes of the explosion. The board blamed the explosion on a Spanish mine. After working around the clock since February, the Mare Island workforce was given the night off on March 31st, and that night around midnight, a major earthquake struck, damaging or destroying nearly every building on the shipyard. Then, just a week later, Spain declared war on the United States. Just 1 week later, under cover of darkness, Admiral George Dewey aboard his flagship USS Olympia led the U.S. Asiatic Squadron into Manila Bay. In the early morning, Dewey's fleet was advancing while under fire from both shore batteries and the Spanish fleet when he spoke into the speaker tube to Captain Charles Gridley. "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Within a couple of hours, the Spanish fleet was destroyed, and the war shifted to Cuba and the Spanish fleet concentrations there. By December, the war was over, the Treaty of Paris was concluded, and U.S. hegemony over foreign terrorists was being celebrated in political cartoons and headlines. As the United States entered the age of empire, it needed a navy capable of projecting power across tens of thousands of miles. In this photo, you see one of those ships rising in Mare Island's building ways in 1908. While Mare Island built ships since its establishment in 1854, the age of empire was a pivot point in the shipyard's evolution as a major building yard. It began when naval constructor Lieutenant Holden Evans stepped off the ferry in 1904 to report for duty. Not only was Evans highly motivated, but he was also a devotee of Taylor's scientific management, or what would become known as industrial engineering. His passion was to reshape the moribund work practices at the shipyard to outcompete those of private shipyards, and he succeeded. His opportunity began when the U.S. Army Transport General Sherman ran aground off Barbers Point in Hawaii, ripping open her double bottom. Her hull needed hundreds of new plates drilled and thousands of rivets removed and reinstalled. Evans' bid to complete the repairs beat the private yard's bids on both cost and schedule. Despite a slow start and resistance from unions, Evans was able to change work practices and complete the work under budget and ahead of schedule. Evans had promised the workforce that successful completion of the work would lead to more work, and he was right. Successful completion of the General Sherman led to an opportunity to build a huge collier in direct competition with New York Naval Shipyard, the premier East Coast shipyard. Mare Island was expected to lose that competition, as it did not have the facilities or experience of the East Coast yard. Wages were higher, and shipping costs and schedule impacts had to be absorbed for all the materials coming from the East Coast. Despite the challenges, Mare Island outperformed the East Coast yard and established itself as a major building yard. Then, in that same year, President Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet arrived in San Francisco Bay to tremendous acclaim. The fleet was on an around-the-world voyage to exercise the fleet and demonstrate U.S. power. The fleet consisted of 16 new battleships and many other ships manned by over 14,000 men. Mare Island had been preparing for months to repair, provision, and coal the fleet before sending it on its way. While the United States had entered the age of empire, our nation remained isolationistic at its core. This manifested itself when war broke out between the monarchies of Europe in 1914. But despite that sentiment, Mare Island was put to work operating a boot camp for Marines that would depart by the thousands for France following U.S. entry into the war. The U.S. resisted pressure to enter the war despite outrages such as the sinking by a German submarine of the passenger liner Lusitania, carrying many American citizens off the Irish coast in 1915. Sadly, this was not an isolated case, as the Germans implemented a new form of warfare, referred to as unrestricted submarine warfare, in a nearly successful attempt to logistically strangle their opponents into submission. While the Allies never capitulated, over 5,000 Allied ships were sunk during the war. Then the United States entered the war in 1917, following a German plot to enlist Mexico as an ally, and Mare Island was put to work not only training Marines to fight the land war in France, but also turning its energy towards building and manning the many destroyers and destroyer escorts needed to protect troop ships and commerce from the submarine menace. In addition, a boot camp for all Navy sailors from west of the Rockies sprung up on Mare Island overnight, as did multiple building ways needed to construct 17 destroyers and destroyer escorts that were required to protect all U.S. resources pouring into France by ship. While World War I was a European war, the Bay Area was touched by the hostilities when an act of sabotage was perpetrated by Germany. This photo shows the ordnance depot at Mare Island following a tremendous explosion on July 9, 1917. If you are familiar with the island, the red arrow points at the location of the Mare Island Cemetery, and here we zoom in on the chief gunner's house that has been destroyed and all its occupants killed. The story begins prior to U.S. entry into the war. The United States was shipping munitions to the Allies from an ordnance depot on Black Tom Island in New Jersey. In response, Germany dispatched a team of saboteurs, and in the early morning hours, a huge explosion rocked the facility, blowing flaming debris onto Ellis Island and so damaging the upraised arm of the Statue of Liberty that it was closed to the public. The saboteurs consisted of a spy the British referred to as the Blonde Bombshell, who smuggled explosives, and two operatives by the name of Kirk Jenke and Lothar Witzke, and together they had come to the west coast and were targeting the ordnance depot at Mare Island. Just as they had done at Black Tom, they snuck on Mare Island in the early morning hours and planted explosives that detonated 300 tons of black powder in a massive explosion that blew out plate glass windows as far away as Petaluma, and blew out windows throughout Vallejo, and blew doors off their hinges and windows out on the Vallejo ferry El Capitan 2 miles away. Everyone in the house of Chief Gunner McKenzie was killed, and they are buried together in the upper part of the Mare Island Cemetery, a short distance from where they perished. Despite the success of German submarines and the introduction of aircraft as a weapon of war during World War I, naval tactics continued to be structured around surface warfare and the post-dreadnought battleship. Mare Island was the only West Coast shipyard to ever build one of these capital ships, and another was also taking shape on the building ways when it was canceled due to the Washington Naval Treaty of 1921. As important as the battleship was, the U.S. Navy was evolving as warfare was moving both above and below the sea, and Mare Island was in the middle of that transition. This is one of my favorite Mare Island photographs, as it features the first Mare Island-built submarine, the Nautilus, in the foreground, and the first aircraft carrier in our history in the background. That aircraft carrier was built at Mare Island as a collier and was converted to the carrier Langley soon after. Mare Island's relationship with submarines began long before the Nautilus, with a submarine flotilla operating at the shipyard just after the turn of the century. Then, in 1910, Mare Island built a landing platform on the cruiser Pennsylvania, and a civilian, Eugene Ely, took off from Tanforan Racetrack in San Bruno and landed on that platform out in San Francisco Bay. After a brief meeting with the captain, he then took off and flew back to Tanforan, proving that it was possible to operate an aircraft from a warship. While that accomplishment was widely applauded, the idea that an aircraft could function effectively or be a threat to something as impregnable as a modern battleship was considered laughable until Army General Billy Mitchell sunk the German battleship Ostfriesland with a near miss of a 2,000-pound bomb. Meanwhile, submarine design and tactics continued to be perfected, and in 1930 Mare Island built and commissioned the Nautilus, and with its range of 9,000 miles, it was capable of operating throughout the Pacific. Mare Island's finest hour came with U.S. entry into World War II, where, like so many other United States industrial workers, the shipyard workers distinguished themselves as a key component of our nation's arsenal of defense. In this photograph, thousands of shipyard workers gather for a bond drive as the entertainer and comedian Bob Hope provides some relief from around-the-clock work. In 1939, the despotic governments of Japan, Germany, and Italy executed what they coined a Pact of Steel, as they set off on wars of conquest worldwide. For us, the war began in the early morning hours of December 7, 1941, outside Pearl Harbor, when the Mare Island-built destroyer USS Ward sighted and sank a Japanese submarine traveling in a restricted area. While the Ward radioed a warning, it was ignored, and Japanese aircraft achieved complete surprise an hour later when the aerial attack began. Word of that attack was first picked up around lunchtime on the continental United States by the huge antenna array that dominated the Mare Island skyline. The shipyard telegrapher was sent scrambling when he received word of the attack in Mare Island's headquarters building across from Alden Park, and he began activating recalls and wartime protocols. Almost overnight, Mare Island's workforce swelled to 45,000 workers as hundreds of ships were repaired and built. So many ships were built in Bay Area shipyards that the combined output averaged a ship a day. So many tank landing craft were built that if moored end to end, they would stretch for over 6 miles. Mare Island also built huge sectional floating dry docks that were towed far out into the Pacific to conduct repairs just outside the battle zone. For years, the battle raged. Then, following the bombing of Japan with 2 atomic bombs on August 14, 1945, the Mare Island workforce was notified that the war was over. This short video captures the workforce as they head home to celebrate after being given 2 days off.
Japanese have accepted our terms fully. That is the word we have just received from the White House in Washington, and I didn't expect to hear a celebration here in our newsroom in New York, but you can hear one going on behind me. We switched to London. I don't know what happened. I'm not even sure whether you heard the first words of Prime Minister Admiral or not. I couldn't hear anything in our speaker here. With the confusion, suddenly we got the word from our private telephone wire from the White House in Washington. The Japanese have accepted fully the surrender terms of the United Nations. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Second World War.
World War II ended when atomic bombs were dropped, forcing the surrender of Japan and ending a planned Allied invasion. In this photograph, the Trinity atomic bomb is shown just before it was successfully tested in 1945. Then, overnight, the United States and the Soviet Union went from allies to enemies, and in 1947, the Truman Doctrine to resist communism was announced. Interestingly, Truman had never heard of the atomic bomb or the Manhattan Project that developed it until President Franklin Roosevelt died earlier in the year. When he traveled to the Potsdam Conference for post-war planning with Churchill and Stalin, he was surprised by Stalin's lack of reaction to his announcement that the United States had successfully exploded an atomic bomb. Stalin did not react because he had spies within both the American and British programs, and he had already purloined plans for the bomb. It is important to note that the bombing of Japan was successful because the Japanese air defenses had already been destroyed. But as the Cold War took hold, slow-moving aircraft carrying nuclear weapons were understood to be extremely vulnerable to countermeasures. In addition to the interceptor aircraft, missiles were also developed with nuclear warheads and were deployed to blow attacking aircraft from the skies. Those missile systems ringed the San Francisco Bay for years. It was clear that a less vulnerable delivery system was needed to make the strategy to prevent nuclear war by mutually assured destruction a credible threat. A program to deploy nuclear-tipped missiles on undetectable submarines hidden beneath the seas began almost immediately, and Mare Island was in the middle of that program for years. Here you see the Mare Island-built USS Cusk firing a Loon missile in 1947. If the missile looks familiar, it should. It was built with German plans for the buzz bombs that rained down on England during World War II. Once it was proven that the Loon missile could be launched and guided from a submarine, the challenge was designing a missile bay that would hold a battery of missiles while submerged. Here, Mare Island Project personnel work on Project Lehigh during the development of just such a missile bay. In those days, before computer-aided software, mock-ups of designs were built to identify interferences and check functionality. Here you see a completed missile bay emerging from Mare Island Structural Shop as part of Project Lehigh. And here you see a missile bay armed with Regulus missiles installed on the Mare Island-built USS Tunney on the Mare Island waterfront. The Tunney deployed for 11 deterrent patrols in this configuration, and with the success of that system, Mare Island continued development of the system. The next milestone achievement for Mare Island was the world's first purpose-built missile submarine, the USS Grayback, and that was followed soon after when Mare Island commissioned the only nuclear-powered Regulus missile submarine, the USS Halibut. As remarkable as the Regulus program was, another program called the Polaris program soon eclipsed it, and Mare Island turned its attention to building a different type of missile boat. Like the Regulus program, the Polaris missile was designed to be carried by submarines, but the similarities ended there. The Regulus missile was a cruise missile fired from a surface submarine and was of limited range. The Polaris missile was a ballistic missile fired while submerged and of much greater range. Once a Polaris missile left its launch tube, it was unstoppable. In this video, you see a couple of ballistic missiles launched from a submarine. As each missile is fired, they streak into the upper atmosphere, where multiple warheads are then released on their ballistic trajectory towards their target. During the 1960s, Mare Island was focused on building the nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine fleet that was central to U.S. nuclear strategy known as the Triad. Under the Triad, submarines constituted the most credible and survivable aspect of nuclear deterrence. Just as Mare Island was instrumental in developing and fielding a key component of our Cold War strategic policy, the shipyard also played important roles in many other areas. The shipyard prepared and analyzed many of the ships used in the atomic bomb tests at the Bikini Atoll during the 1950s. In addition, 17 nuclear-powered submarines were built, including Vallejo's namesake, the Fleet Ballistic Missile Submarine, USS Mariana G. Vallejo, which you can see here at her launch in 1965. As she slides down the building ways, you can see the thousands of people on both sides of the river cheering her on. The Navy also took advantage of the North Bay's rivers and sloughs by establishing a training center on the shipyard for the brownwater Navy that was fighting in Vietnam. Tiger teams were routinely sent around the world to repair battle force ships and keep them on station, while back at Mare Island, operations went on around the clock, overhauling and repairing ships. In the 1970s, the Navy was publicly researching saturation diving with its Sea Lab projects, but as those projects went on, other highly classified programs capitalizing on that capability operated from the shipyard. These black programs were a joint operation of the Navy, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Agency, and were of such importance that they eventually involved over 20% of the shipyard's workload. This is the USS Parche, the Navy's most decorated submarine ever, off San Francisco as she returns from a mission. Mare Island cut this submarine in half and inserted a classified hull section referred to as plug. That hull section allowed saturation divers to operate from within the ship. Part of what those divers were doing was an operation codenamed Ivy Bells that involved placing modules such as this next to Soviet undersea cables and recording military communications. Those tapes were rushed to analysts in Washington, D.C. when the ocean engineering boats returned to Mare Island, and they are credited with helping to lower Cold War tensions through a better understanding of Soviet intent. The picture of the tap is available because it was on display in the Soviet Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow. The Soviets recovered the tap when a former National Security Agency intelligence analyst turned traitor, Ronald Pelton. He sold out our country for $37,000. The Ocean Engineering Program also modified the deep sea submergence vehicle Seacliff to triple its design depth to 20,000 feet. The submersible was classified, but an enterprising young officer somehow got the famous San Francisco stripper, Carol Dota, onto the shipyard for this photo op, much to the chagrin of security personnel. The end for Mare Island Naval Shipyard came with the dissolution of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That process began in Poland in the early 1980s as shipyard labor unions succeeded in forcing elections despite Soviet attempts to suppress speech. Then, in 1989, the East German government announced it would no longer suppress travel to West Germany, and the Berlin Wall came down. Despite many attempts to reform, the weaknesses of the underlying Soviet economy could not be overcome, and in 1991 the Soviet Union collapsed, and with that collapse the Cold War was over, and, once again, our military entered a sustained period of decline. 2 years later, in 1993, the Department of Defense released its base closure list, which included Mare Island Naval Shipyard. Once released, supporters of Mare Island's only hope was for an independent commission to find the Department of Defense had deviated from its own force structure plan, and that did not happen. In June, that commission voted unanimously to close Mare Island. The flag was hauled down for the last time on April 1, 1996, and Mare Island was closed. Mare Island is a place with many historic features and buildings, but as written by the last shipyard commander, its real legacy is the thousands of people who came together over 142 years to positively influence and impact events worldwide. Thank you for your interest in Mare Island Naval Shipyard and how it factored so importantly into the establishment of our country's presence on the Pacific coast while projecting that presence worldwide. This iconic photograph captures a critical moment in time as U.S. Marines plant the U.S. flag atop Mount Suribachi on the Japanese home island of Iwo Jima. The bloody invasion of Iwo Jima was the culmination of a naval and island-hopping campaign that ended the brutal Japanese imperialistic war of aggression in the Pacific during World War II. As battle continued to rage, this flag was pulled from a landing craft and run up to the mountaintop for all to see. Put on display in a case at the National Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, D.C. decades later, it was discovered that the welt of the flag was labeled with Mare Island Flag Loft. Its place in the logistical chain and its role in that battle make this flag a fitting metaphor for Mare Island's 142 years of service, building and maintaining the fleet and providing the men and material necessary to implement our nation's strategic objectives. Come see us firsthand where history happened at Mare Island. Tour the Mare Island Historic District, hold your event in one of our amazing venues, or support us in our mission to build greater unity by an increased mutual understanding of our shared heritage.